All right, everyone, welcome back. This is Chapter 1, Social Influence, Obedience, Dispositional Explanations. This is the fourth video in a four-video series on obedience. Let's dive right in. In case you haven't noticed, we have a mind map of the entire obedience subchapter. You can find the link in the video description below and print this out and use it whichever way you like. Now, let's look at a new researcher. His name is TheodoreAdorno, and he had a question. Why do some people follow orders and others don't? As you remember, we already talked about some experiments where not everybody followed the orders given. For example, 16 out of 18 nurses didn't follow the doctor's orders. They were asked to give an excessive drug dose to a patient. They knew it was dangerous, and they were able to resist the orders of the doctor, the person in authority. Similarly, Milgram was not able to convince all of his participants to go up to 450 volts. In the original study, only 65% went all the way. So what is it about the ones that didn't follow the orders? What makes them different? And the theory that Adorno developed was that obedience is not due to situational variables like the proximity or the location or the uniform. It has to do something with dispositional factors, i.e. something inside of the individual, such as their personality, that we can't see from the outside, but if we were to check it, we could predict who is going to follow the orders and who is not. So Adorno set out to design a questionnaire to do exactly that. For his experiment, Adorno recruited 2,000 middle-class white Americans who were given the questionnaire to fill out, and the questionnaire was geared towards checking for fascism. So how likely were participants to lean towards fascism? Didn't mean that they were fascist, just did they have some personality traits that would make them more likely to follow fascist propaganda, for example, right? And that's why the questionnaire is also called the F scale. Now, here are two examples of what kind of questions were inside that questionnaire. Number one, obedience and respect for authority are the most important virtues for children to learn. Do you strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree with that statement? Second question. There is hardly anything lower than a person who does not feel great love, gratitude, and respect for his parents, right? It's generally a positive argument, a positive statement to make. And the question then is like, this one, for example, right? Love, gratitude, and respect for your parents. If you have that trait, or you strongly agree with that, Adorno would probably, I suppose, give you a higher score on the F scale, meaning you would probably lean more towards fascism. Not that loving your parents makes you more fascist. It's just that people that can show great love and gratitude towards parents probably can also show great love and gratitude towards a state, for example, or a dictator, right? And so that's how Adorno designed these questions. Like, what kind of question would somebody who is very likely to follow a fascist government, what kind of questions would they answer with agree and strongly agree? Okay? Now, here are the results. He identified that people who scored really high on his questionnaire, they had these following traits. These people identified with strong individuals, strong people, so high social status, standing in society. They were generally contemptuous of the weak, meaning they looked down upon weaker individuals, meaning maybe in social hierarchy wise. So you could argue maybe people that didn't have a job or are homeless or something like that, or they did jobs they thought were not worth the while. They were very conscious of status, so of their own and of others. They showed extreme respect, deference, and servility to people in higher status. So they looked up to people who were higher up in the social hierarchy. And they had a certain cognitive style. So they saw the world very much in black and white, right? Either everything is good or everything is bad. And they had fixed and distinct stereotypes about other groups, right? All XYZ people are like this and that. This kind of thinking, whereas you could say, well, it depends, and but no, that's like a gray shades of gray kind of thinking. These people tended to be more on the black and white kind of view of the world. From his research findings, Adorno then synthesized an authoritarian personality. And somebody with an authoritarian personality will have these traits. Let's look at them one by one. People with an authoritarian personality have an extreme respect for authority. They view society as weak than it once was. They believe that society needs strong leaders. They have contempt for inferior social status, meaning looking down upon. And they feel uncomfortable with uncertainty, so they like certainty. And they have an inflexible outlook on life, so they see the world in black and white. Okay. Now, Adorno was speculating, where do people get that personality from? And he argued that it's actually coming from parenting styles, especially harsh parenting. So, harsh parenting means expecting absolute loyalty, having impossible high standards, severe criticism of failings, so very strict discipline kind of parenting style. And the effect is that the kids will feel great hostility, but they cannot express it towards their parents because they're going to get in trouble. So what they do is they project their feelings onto others, right? And so they move their feelings, they displace. They should actually be really geared towards the parents, but because they cannot do that, they let it out onto somebody else, and usually then onto others who are weak within society, somebody they can look down upon and so on, just like the parents would onto the child. Okay, now let's look at some evaluation. What can the authoritarian personality do for us in research? Can it predict anything? What can we do with it? So there's a research study by Elms and Milgram, where basically you team up Adorno and Milgram. You take Milgram's original research study with the electric shocks, and you also ask participants to afterwards fill out the F-scale personality questionnaire that Adorno had designed. And what do we find? The 20 original obedient participants who scored significantly higher the 12 original obedient participants, the ones that went all the way to 450 volts, they also scored significantly higher on the F scale than compared to the disobedient participants, meaning that if you go all the way to 450 volts, you are also likely to have a higher score on the F scale than people that didn't go all the way to 450 volts. That means the authoritarian personality questionnaire is tracking something, right? It is able to predict to some degree whether people are going to follow the rules or not, whether people are going to electrocute somebody to 450 volts. That is intriguing. Okay, so let's look at some evidence against this authoritarian personality. Well, if you ask these participants about their backstory, about their childhood, turns out they didn't glorify their fathers, they didn't experience unusual levels of punishment in childhood, and they didn't have hostile attitudes towards their mothers, which was another point mentioned by Adorno for his personality, for authoritarian personality definition, right? And so his definition of authoritarian personality, especially where it comes from childhood, from child rearing, is not doesn't correlate with the participants from this study right here, right? So that is something to consider, that the authoritarian personality doesn't perfectly predict people and their likelihood of being obedient or disobedient. So the conclusion: authoritarian personality is not a reliable predictor for whether somebody will be obedient or not, right? But it does do something, right? It does correlate with that original study. So there is some kind of link, but it's not a very strong link, okay? So there's an interesting set of criticisms of the authoritarian personality question that I'd like to look at. Here's a question: how did the entire German nation turn against Jews? Right? How is it that millions of people followed the Nazi Party into the Second World War and into an anti-Semitic stance? Right? It's not like all the Germans had an authoritarian personality. If they had all taken the F-scale questionnaire, they wouldn't all have turned out to be authoritarian personality. So something doesn't add up here, right? So there's some other factor going on that is separate from the F scale that we're not measuring, that is playing a larger role here, right? So the alternative explanation is, again, our friend social identity theory. The idea here being that the Germans did identify with the Nazi Party. They liked the Nazi Party and they thought they were doing good work. And the Nazi Party was anti-Semitic, so therefore the Germans identified with being anti-Semitic as well, right? So this basically saying the Nazi Party is part of my my social identity, and therefore being anti-Semitic also fits inside my social identity. Right? That is the argument made here. A completely separate criticism by Christian Jahoda is that the authoritarian personality is, the F scale is actually biased towards right-wing tendencies. And the argument here is that if you look at left-wing authoritarianism, so your Soviet Bolshevism and your Chinese Maoism, you find very similar right-wing characteristics, like they demand complete obedience to political authority, right? If you think of Stalin and Mao, they were very, very authoritarian. So you can find authoritarianism also on the left. But this F scale is only particularly interested in the fascist, in the right-wing authoritarianism. So kind of these researchers saying that this scale is incomplete. You're not looking at the other kind of authoritarianism on the left-hand side of the political spectrum, right? And therefore, the conclusion then is that Adorno's theory does not cover obedience across the entire political spectrum. And that is a fair argument. And maybe Adorno would have to sit down and redesign his F scale to be more of an FC communist, or F, basically an entire political spectrum kind of questionnaire. If you would like to test yourself in terms of how you score on the F scale, you can go ahead and click on this link, which is in the video description below, and go through the online questionnaire. It will score you automatically, and you can find out where you land. There's something I want to point out here. Just because if you happen to get a high score on this, it doesn't mean, right, that you are a bad person or anything like that. It's just that we humans differ, and you have seen now through the evaluation of our discussion here about the questionnaire that it's not very powerful in predicting much, okay? And so if you score high on it, it doesn't mean much, all right? So that's it for today. If you'd like to download these slides, you can find them following the link in the video description below. If you are a teacher and you'd like to quiz your students on this content, you can sign up for free on ZenTeach and use our quizzing tool. Consider donating, following us on Twitter and YouTube, and definitely subscribe to get all the latest YouTube videos. The next lesson will be on obedience.